Hi everyone. Yeah, as Steph was saying, my name is Carlos Abrahams. I live and work in the UK, and I have two jobs. I work as an ecology consultant for a firm covering through the country, looking at environmental impact assessments of sort of one size or another. And I also am a lecturer at Nottingham Trent University as well, close to where I live. I also, in my spare time, do or try to do research on bioacoustics, mostly on birds to date. And what I want to do really quite quickly is run through a draft sort of standard protocol I produced a couple of years ago. There's a link to this later. It's in a fairly obscure in-house magazine for the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, CIEM in the UK, and was put in there to try and raise the profile of bioacoustic surveys within consultancy within the UK, and that's working to a certain extent so far, but I'm going to talk about a little bit about the background of how that developed and what it says in there, hopefully for other people to take from or argue down maybe. Before I get onto that though, I'm going to start off with a very quick introduction to sound and bird sound. I know on the webinar there's people with more experience than me in some cases, and people who are sort of starting off on potentially looking at using acoustic recording to look at birds or other wildlife. And so what I want to establish very quickly at the start is how we can look at sound, how we can record it and make use of the information we can get from birds, amphibians, mammals, whatever else it might be. And so starting with the very, very basic, and this is overly simplistic, we can look at sound in one of two parameters, I suppose, or characteristics, and that's the volume of it. Is it quiet or loud? And is it low pitched or high pitched? So the frequency and the amplitude. And we can record that with a variety of different recording devices or listen to it with our ears, and try and use those two characteristics to define different sorts of sound from birds or other animals. And the volume or the amplitude varies considerably depending what species we're dealing with, and we normally use a decibel scale to give that a value or a figure, and this decibel scale is related to the human range of hearing, and so silence is 0 decibels pretty much, and then it goes up in a logarithmic scale. Important to remember that, where a whisper is 20 decibels, conversation 60 decibels, shouting, higher than that. Nightingale's quite loud for a bird species, 85 decibels. Power saws 110. The white bellbird is the loudest bird currently recorded at 125 decibels. So that's not just double conversation levels. You need to think that's logarithmically much, much larger than the sound of somebody talking. Jet engines and howler monkeys 140 decibels, and then blue whales 188, so super, super loud. And we can create a graph of that amplitude once we've recorded sound, and I'll get onto how later. As we can see here, for a variety of different birds, marsh wren, western meadowlark here, and we can see that the center of this line is 0 decibels, so silence, and the wider this sort of bar chart gets, up and down below the 0 line, shows how loud something is. So that's amplitude. Second to that, we can talk about the frequency, so how bassy or squeaky something is, and humans have a very wide range of hearing in terms of the frequencies we can hear. So we go down to 20 hertz, 20 cycles, 20 vibrations in the air per second, up to 20,000 hertz, so very quite high frequency. Anything below 20 hertz we term infrasound, and some baleen whales and other animals can produce sound at very low frequencies that we can't hear, and these have very long wavelengths as a result. Above 20 kilohertz, we call that ultrasound, and bats, some insects, some whales and dolphins, other species produce frequencies that go from 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz up to 100, 120 kilohertz, so very, very high frequency indeed with very short wavelengths. Most birds, are in the lower range or producing sound in the lower range of human hearing. So we have bitterns, down at about 200 hertz, cuckoos, double that, something like that. Squeaky-ish sandpipers at about 5 kilohertz, and goldcrests up at 7. I've got some couple of sounds here just to illustrate that. If I play a bittern sound, the Pavarotti of birds up to goldcrest, or sandpiper. See if I can get the right one with my cursor. No, I can't. Won't play. Very high frequency. If I could only press the button. There we go. Anyway, but moving on, you have to imagine the different sounds that are coming out of those for yourself. If we put those two things together, the amplitude and frequency, we can create a different sort of graph called a spectrogram for a whole range of different species here, and we can see we have frequency going up the Y scale, 2 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz, up to 10 kilohertz. Time along the bottom, and this is second intervals here. And so we can create a graph of time against frequency, and then we can colour it in for the amplitude. So we have red in this graph as the loudest sounds and blue as fairly quiet ones. And we can see the different birds make different sounds, obviously, and we can graph those, and when we look at them on a screen once we've recorded them, we can see how those vary from species to species. So we can see that this great tit here goes teacher, 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 and chiff chaff goes chiff chaff, chiff chaff, chiff chaff, chiff chaff, and we can hear these fat bits in the middle of the sweeping call that chiff chaff does. So we can record sound, we can listen to it, and we can also look at it in pictures on the graph if we produce a spectrogram. And we can take that information and we can use it for studying biology. And biologists, ornithologists, have been using sound for a couple of hundred years, or for longer, as long as we've had ears, I suppose, to record birds, listen to them, and try and work out what species are where and what they're doing. But the thing that's happened in the last 10 to 20 years is the sort of digital revolution has allowed us to do that in much quicker and much more detail and to a much greater extent than when we were just recording things by pen and paper. And that sort of technology has been taken up extensively in two main areas so far, by cetacean researchers offshore and by bat researchers as well. And there's good practice being developed for those. There's lots of people who've been out doing this professionally on a more amateur basis as well. And we have a written down guidance for how to go and do bat surveys for professional ecologists within the UK. Similar guidance produced in Eurobats across the EU as well, and there's good practice in Europe, States, and other parts of the world in terms of marine mammals as well. So those two areas, they've been using this technology because there's no real other way to record those species accurately and effectively without doing this. So, but the same thing has not really happened for birds yet. And a couple of years ago, I organised a very small conference at Nottingham to invite a few people together to look at how we might start to develop the use of bioacoustics for birds in the UK, where we are lagging behind other countries to a certain extent. And some of the benefits that have been shown for cetaceans and for mammals also apply to other species and other taxa as well. And they taking recordings from the field allows us a number of benefits that aren't really available from other sort of traditional standard survey methods, and that allows us to do long duration data capture, because we can put records in the field for a long time. Once we have a recording, we can listen to that over and over again, rather than just trying to interpret a snippet of bird song, for example, in the field. So it allows quality assurance processes. It gives us a permanent raw data record of a species presence or absence at a particular location, and allows us other benefits in terms of methods, such as greater standardization in data collection, and potentially less observer bias as well. Some disbenefits and reasons why people aren't using it currently is at least in the past, bioacoustic equipment is quite expensive potentially, and so there is a capital cost up front. The analysis methods are fairly limited in some respects so far, in terms of how we analyse that, though come back next week to hear about some of the developments. In some parts of the world, in some taxa, there's a sort of current lack of expertise and skills in bioacoustics. So although there has been a fairly decent scientific basis and a fair bit of research done in many parts of the world in terms of the use of bioacoustics for birds, there isn't really any sort of standard guidance that's been produced to try and collate that and allow non-researchers to apply some of these benefits. So that's what the article I put together a couple of years ago was all about, hopefully, how to apply this sort of approach to birds, and trying to take some of the learning from the world of whales and dolphins and bats, and apply that to other species. So quickly moving on to some of the practical things. When we're looking at recording birds or whatever, there's two basic approaches we can take. We can either go out with some sort of microphone in a hand and find birds and point it at them and record, or we can take a passive acoustic monitoring approach with automated units and stick those in the field to do the recording for us. So handheld recorders are good for a whole range of different things, and there's different equipment you can use and different recording techniques you can use, but that's for another day. I'm not really going to cover those, but it's worth having a go and trying to learn more about those. What I'm going to talk about today is the use of automated recorders instead. And these are plastic boxes, like this WILDLABS Acoustics unit that's strapped to the tree there. They, generally speaking, for birds at least, the best approaches are using a full spectrum recorder. Other recording techniques are available, like frequency division and zero crossing. If you know about those, you'll know the good points and bad points and why they're used for bats sometimes. But for birds, full spectrum that records the whole range of frequency, like if you were just recording voice on your phone or something like that, is the way to approach. These units are available with either stereo mono microphones, so the left and right channels on some of them, so you can record in different directions. That can be useful in some cases. They normally all take SD card slot to record the information on the files onto, have internal batteries, have schedulers to turn them on and off, and so they know what time it is, and some of them are GPS linked as well, so you can link to known locations. And some of them, yeah, are fully waterproof, some are not. So that's the basic background, and for the next few minutes, I just want to talk about how took some of those principles, some of the feedback I got from the conference 2 years ago, and used that and a lot of the published science to try and develop a recommended standard protocol for recording birds with. And this was mostly aimed at breeding bird assemblages within the UK European setting, but a lot of the research has been done in other places, and a lot of these principles will apply worldwide, really. So first off, the kit. There are a whole range of different, there's a few different pieces of recording equipment that are available. Some of the pictures of these on the site are the WILDLABS Acoustics SM4, the WILDLABS Acoustics SM Mini, which is the new version of one there, yeah. nice, a bit cheaper, a bit lighter to carry. Cornell Lab over in America produces Swift unit, and then there's an Australian manufacturer, Frontier Labs, that also produces a piece of kit. These are all pretty much do the same thing. They're all available as a standard unit off the shelf, and you can basically plug in batteries, plug in cards, set them to play, strap them to a tree or something, and they will record. They're mostly or all programmable in terms of various different settings, whether that's the recording settings in terms of the sound that's recorded, or times, dates that they switch on, whether they can sort of track turning on at sunset, sunrise, and other things like that, depending on the firmware and the model that you get. Important things about kit is that kit does not last forever, and they do vary. So they should be individually numbered, checked, calibrated at least on a regular basis. This paper I've referenced down here by Turgeon et al. From 2017 did testing of microphones from a variety of different units and found that after about 2 years of reasonable use in the field, that the microphone's quality was no longer any good, certainly not consistent with new microphones if you're replacing broken ones or whatever else. And so microphones especially do need checking on a regular basis to make sure the sensitivity is still okay and they are still recording as you'd expect. Alongside those slightly more expensive units, pretty much everybody who's listening will have probably heard of Audiomoth. Very good unit for the price. Yeah, you can't get anything else that does this for £50. They are programmable in terms of the settings, turn on, turn off times, can record the full acoustic into the ultrasonic range, so you can record birds and bats and other things at the same time. Nice and small. Issue with these is the firmware is not quite as good as on some of the more expensive units. They don't have separate clock batteries, so when you take the batteries out, once they're failed, then you lose the settings and the program that's on there, while these units have separate batteries in here, so you can actually hot swap batteries and cards out and it will keep the same settings going. So you can just plug in new batteries if you're keeping a recorder in one location, for example, and it will just turn back on and do the same thing again, while you have to reprogram this every time you change the batteries on it. But like I say, yeah, horses for courses, and Audiomoth, really good piece of kit. Lots of people still create their own, and some of these are open source machines and associated firmware, software, and whatever else for analysis. These two have been published in the last couple of years. The Solo Recorder by Robin Whitelock in Methods in Ecology and Evolution, and Orita by Rich Beeson. So these are sort of homemade out of components you can buy quite cheaply, put together with sort of Raspberry Pi or other microprocessor boards with power banks in and whatever else. So those are available, are used. My recommendation would be to go for one of the others, unless you like electronics and fiddling with kit and a soldering iron, of course. So once you've got the detector, you need to set it up correctly, and the audio settings will depend on what you want to record. But for birds, generally speaking, my recommendation is for sample rates of 44 to 48 kilohertz and 16 or maybe better 24 bit depth. For those who don't know, bit depth is basically the resolution or the range of the amplitude that you can record. So the higher the bit depth, the more steps you get in the volume scale. With the sample rate is how many times the frequency is sampled within a recording. And so the higher the sample rate, the better, the higher resolution your frequency data. But importantly, it also sets the maximum frequency that you can record according to the Nyquist formula. So a 48 kilohertz sample rate will record up to 24 kilohertz sound. Yeah, 24 kilohertz sample rate will record up to 12 kilohertz sound, so you need double the sample rate of whatever you want to record. So 48 kilohertz will record the whole of human range of hearing plus a bit into the ultrasound, and therefore is a good high resolution setting for recording birds with. If you're recording bats, you need higher. Yeah, if you want to save on battery life and especially data storage, you can use a lower sample rate setting. If you're recording Kappa Cayleys or something low frequency at 2 to 3 kilohertz, for example, you could reduce your sample rate, still record in sufficient detail to record the species and within the frequency range, but half or quarter the data storage requirements for a particular species. And importantly, yeah, if you're putting more than one detector out, make sure they all match before they go out. Same firmware, same settings, so you're recording the same sort of sound across a study, across a different area. Survey effort and timing, very important. There's a fair bit of research work that's been looked at this in terms of how best to sample. Of course, when you put a recorder out, you could just press go and record 24 hours a day until the batteries run out and the card is full. But if you want to maximize the length of the recording period and prevent a sort of wasteful data mounting with extra info that you don't need, then focus on whatever you're trying to record. For breeding birds and the sampling protocol I put together, my suggestion is 2 deployments, one early in the spring, one late in the spring, record for 5 hours at dawn and with 1 minute sample every 10 minutes and cover at least a 3-day period. Then later in the spring, yeah, 5 hours at dawn again, for at least 3 days. If you also want to record a dusk chorus, or if you're interested in nightjars, owls, and that sort of thing that record at night, then a 3-hour sampling period at sunset is also super useful as well. When you're recording and placing the units in the field, probably the most important thing is, if you are trying to use this quantitatively, is make sure that you're not recording the same bird at more than one recording location, unless you really want to do. Yeah, you can put arrays out and use time of arrival differences of sound at different recorders to localize birds. But generally, if we're looking at sort of vocal activity rates or presence absence across a landscape, then we want to make sure that we're only picking up each bird at one location, so we're not double counting. As a very general rule of thumb, most passerine small birds, yeah, will have a sort of vocal distance range of around about 50 meters or so, depending on what the habitat is like, what the topography is like, and the weather conditions and other things like that. So you need to put your detectors at least 100 meters apart to make sure that you're not double counting. To be safe and to cover a slightly wider area, my recommendation within the protocol is for sampling locations to be at least 250 meters away. And one way to deploy that is to do a 250 meter grid and then potentially select locations within that on a sort of random basis, potentially. When you're putting the kit out, they need to be up off the ground, because low ground vegetation will cut down noise and sound transmission quite a lot. So 1 to 2 meters off the ground or potentially higher can be quite useful. There's a paper that came out last year, I think, that showed, yeah, if you get your recorders 4 or 5 or more meters off the ground, then actually they have a better detection range. And you should try and make sure there's no masking vegetation around them at height, so not within dense trees potentially, or on the side of a building or a very big tree that's going to cut out sound from one direction or the next. Moving on swiftly, once you've recorded that data, you need to record metadata about that data as well, because it's good having all the sound information and trying to make use of it, but unless you've got background information on recording location, recording date, what time it was, what the weather conditions were like, what the recorder you were using was, then that information, sound recordings are not that useful. So metadata is super useful. Because it's an acoustic recorder, you can record metadata just by speaking into the microphone when you switch it on. You can talk into there, and the metadata then becomes part of the sound recording of whatever it is that you captured. Other ways to do it are to use the tablet-based devices, GPS approach, and we use this work. So record the location using GPS on an iPad or phone, and you can get various different systems. My favourite is Fulcrum, where you can fill in the form of associated metadata. What direction the microphone's pointing in, what's the number of the microphone, what's the serial number of the unit, so you know which microphone and which recorder was in which location associated with the recording, and take photos and whatever else we need in terms of information. Most decent recording systems also record metadata as part of the WAV files that they are saving onto the system. So the actual sound file has metadata built in. I don't know about other systems, but WILDLABS Acoustics kit uses a modified version of the Guano metadata system, which was originally developed for batch recording. And as you can see in this sort of thing here, if you have GPS location, we have the GPS coordinates, location accuracy, location elevation, etc., etc. The use of any high pass or low pass filters or other audio settings. We've got the sample rate recorded there, and this is recorded, as I say, as metadata within every single WAV file that's recorded on the system, and that can be accessed later as needed. So you have some data, you want to do something with it. I'm not going to talk about data analysis methods today because I've nearly run out of time, and it's days by itself. But basically, data analysis of sound files needs to do two things. It needs to first detect a sound event, whether that's a bird calling, a bat calling or whatever, and then ideally it needs to classify that to ideally some species or taxa. And there are various approaches to doing that. For a lot of the bird analysis work that I've done, I've used Kaleidoscope Pro, which has a clustering system built in, which sorts sound files into different sorts of sound, and then you can identify those manually. For those who've used it, you know that Kaleidoscope has also got in a built-in automated detector for bat calls. And there's a whole range of different machine learning tools that are being developed rapidly to try and sort bird calls out. Those work to a greater or lesser extent, and success rate. And so an approach generally for most studies at the moment is some sort of machine learning clustering approach with a fair amount of manual review and classification needed to check those are right. Options for software, and if you're on Twitter in the last couple of days, you'll see that Tessa Reinhardt, who's doing the talk next week, has just been getting together a list of different software. My recommendations are threefold. For a general viewer, Audacity is good for looking at sound files and editing those. I use Kaleidoscope quite a lot and can talk about that more later. And then R with the C-Wave package and other packages that are being produced for sound analysis is very good. Other bits of software are available. For output, once we have that data, ideally we should be generating some sort of species list for a site, or identifying which species occurred in which sound files, and if we know where those sound files were produced and at what time, what date, then we can work out a whole range of different things, whether that's presence, absence at a particular location, lists of species at a location, see how things vary from day to day or through the course of season, and can do more complicated things by looking at spatial patterns, density, population, occupancy, modelling as well, and even identify individuals from the shape and sound of their calls as well. And we are running out of time, so just a plug for my bit of my work. Over the last few years I've been in some work on Kappa Cayley, looking at how we can use acoustic monitoring to look at Kappa Cayley leks. At the moment, this is a bird that's currently going extinct for the second time in Scotland, or hopefully not, and they monitor leks by hiding out in hides during the spring and try and record the number of males, or they record Kappa Cayleys by wandering through Scottish forests in the winter, and the average hit rate for doing that is 1 Kappa Cayley every 20 kilometres of walking, so it's not very fun work for those people who are doing it. Taking a bioacoustics approach, we've managed to look at call activity in the leks. So this is where all the male birds gather together in the spring, record the numbers of calls to going, and try and relate that, look at over a course of days or through the course of one particular day to see when they're most active, and have found that actually the number of calls we record at a site is a pretty good estimator for the number of male birds to there, so we can potentially use it for population levels assessment. I won't talk about disturbance for now. Also, heathland birds down the south of the UK, we can take sort of more widespread occupancy modelling type approaches and see where the birds are, where they're most active. Overlay this with GIS and satellite data to look at habitat preferences, and we can also look at the different call types that male nightjars produce. If I'm going to the next slide, which it won't do, to see how the different song types varied between males that are in a pair, with a female on a nest, and unpaired males, to try and understand their sort of breeding behaviour, distribution, and the habitat use by paired males, and try and understand the population levels of this particular species. And so to wrap up, benefits for bioacoustics are that alongside potentially other traditional survey methods, it gives us better survey information, allows us to cover longer time periods. The data is potentially more consistent than data coming in from a range of different surveyors with different skill levels. We can cover more sites with less effort. We can do synchronized recording at different locations. So one person can't be everywhere all the time, but a whole range of different acoustic recorders can be, and potentially it's less intrusive and causes less disturbance to the species we're trying to look at. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos.
Sorry, that was a race through. Sorry.
Oh no. Well, I mean, I did see how many slides you had, so we were suspicious this might be the case. But thank you. I mean, you walked through a lot of stuff that I've wondered about. So thank you so much for just, I think that was a fantastic intro, like just getting started with acoustic monitoring. So thank you so much. We do have a list of questions coming through. I'm going to read the first one out.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to make you, let's see if I can make you pinned. Yeah, cool. Does that make you big for everyone else? Or is that just for me and the recording? Don't worry, everyone. Oh, it does? Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Good feedback. Okay, Carlos had a question for you, Carlos. Does clustering work for bird sounds? He means to determine what kind of birds are around. And he's talking about clustering as an machine learning technique to group similar data, decibel levels, for instance. He doesn't know about frequency. Apparently, you can do it for frequency parameters as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I don't know the background to it. The Kaleidoscope Pro uses hidden Markov models. Yeah, I know what it means. I don't know what it stands for. I don't know what it means. But basically, you can take a whole range of different sound, and it's sort of machine learning, but not, because with machine learning, generally you need annotated data to start with, that this is that species, that's that species, and it will look for similar things within your data set that you're feeding it. Within the Kaleidoscope Pro, basically you just hit it with a load of WAV files, and it will compare all of the different sounds that you're giving it within those WAV files based on a frequency and length parameters that you can define. and it will basically say these sounds are like this, these sounds are like that, and it works pretty well at separating out a load of passerines. So quite typically within the UK, you would get 3 clusters that are all blackbirds. Blackbirds doing slightly different things. You'll have a number of different clusters that are blue tits or great tits or song thrushes or whatever else. And so it will recognize the different sounds and group them for you. And then you can go through and classify those longhand yourself. And the annotation tools within Kaleidoscope are good to allow you to do that quickly. So you can feed hours and hours and hours of data, end up with a spreadsheet that's 25,000 different snippets of call, and you can go through those pretty quickly and classify them yourself. And then you can actually take that classification and feed it back in to the same or new data to allow it to classify new data as well. So if you've not tried it, then I'd recommend download the free trial of Kaleidoscope and feed it some data and give it a go. You get 15 days with clustering and see how that works for you. But it's allowed me to go through big reams of data quickly without having to first develop a sort of machine learning model a priori. Yeah.
You said that was a great answer, so thank you. Robin, you're up next. Do you want to jump in?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Great.
Robin, hi.
Hi, Carlos. Thank you very much for your talk. I just got a question for you concerning the loudness or the dB directly at the source, like, for example, the beak. Do you have like a resource we can check out different bird species, or do you know something about Kappa Cayley, for example?
No, I don't. So none of my work really has looked at sound levels and trying to measure distances and that sort of thing. And so I know previous colleagues, sort of relied on that quite a lot for whales and dolphins, where they know it, and they, use sonar equations to see how far away the whales and dolphins are based on the sound pressure level at the microphone and that sort of thing. But I think what there is available in terms of that is quite sketchy for a lot of species, and I can't point you, unfortunately, at any good sources for birds. No.
So we just have to collect it.
Yeah, I think so. That's probably the best, the best way. If you've got a captive Kappa Cayley in a cage somewhere, there you go. Yes, yeah. So I mean, you would think that certainly for some of those species that are fairly closely monitored or have captive breeding programs or whatever else like that, then it'd be quite easy to go and do, and certainly worthwhile, I think, because Kappa Cayley, as you'll know, quite strange in terms of the range of the calls, doesn't really go as far through the forest as you'd expect it to, and it would be useful, super useful at lecking sites to know how that varies. But whether it varies between different individuals as well would be good to know as well, because big Kappa Cayleys as opposed to smaller ones, dominant males probably louder and produce different, as well as different frequencies, different amplitudes in their calls as well. So.
Okay, Ruth, do you want to jump in now?
Sure. Thanks so much, Carlos, for your talk, and also WildLabs for creating these awesome bioacoustic collaborative spaces. Yeah, I'm part of Future Generations University Songs of Adaptation project, working exactly in this stuff, bird tracking climate change through bird species, and we're using artificial intelligence AI models for our data analysis. So I guess my question is kind of in that niche right there, but I'm wondering, we're at a moment where we're looking at our thresholds of how accurate our model thinks it is, and then comparing that to our manual verification of our partners listening to those results. And I just wonder, kind of in that conversation, so the model is saying it's 0.9999% sure, and then our partners are saying it's about 50% accurate from that. And our partners are very excited about that because it's easier than listening to reams and reams and reams and hours of data. But what is kind of the standard out there for publication? And are people doing manual verification, or are we mostly in a world where we're looking at the threshold and tracking the improvement of models via the threshold? So just, I don't know, it's a pretty niche area, but I wonder if there's comments both from you guys and then also maybe in the forum later, but this is kind of where we are in our analysis. So would appreciate any comments. Thanks.
Can I jump first? Ruth, I would say definitely join our talk next week with Tessa, because she's going to be covering automated processing. So
absolutely love Tessa. She's so great.
Thanks. Carlos, have a crack.
Yeah, the papers that have been published, I think Ellie Knight did a paper back 2017, 2018, looking at reporting the quality of classifications and pointing out it's really important whenever any of these systems are used to be reporting what the precision and recall, so 2 stats to say how good the classification is, and those should always be reported in papers. A lot of those range around about 0.7 to 0.8, so 80% good, 70% good, depending on how many false positives and false negatives the classification systems are doing. So as long as within the published research I've seen that they are making allowances for that, reporting those and giving some indication of how good the classification systems are, then that's okay. So yeah, those, it's never going to be perfect, and yeah, humans aren't perfect at identifying birds or whatever as well, so there's always an error rate in terms of your manual classifications that you're using to prove the automated classifications as well. But one of the sort of the key things and where we are at the moment really, I think, is having a classification system that's good enough, not perfect, to at least allow us to filter a lot of the rubbish out and allow the manual ID to just take place on a small subset of the total recorded data. And if artificial intelligence approaches, ML, whatever, can reduce the workload for this human assessors, then that's a good approach to be taken, at least for the moment, I think, and will always be needed anyway to a certain extent. Don't know whether that answers the question or not.
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anton, do you want to jump in?
Can you hear me?
We can, yes. Go ahead.
Thanks, Carlos, for the talk. And I think that I have a problem because it's like I have a bias from the camera trap, that is another sensor. And sometimes I use the random encounter model. And there an adaptation for bioacoustic, the generalized random encounter model, to study the density with that type of sensor. But I think that now the more of the studies are occupancies and species distribution focus and not about density. And if there are a model, then you can estimate the density. Why there are not a lot of paper or people and groups trying to estimate the density with the generalized random encounter model?
I don't know anything about generalized random control models, unfortunately, but as I say, there's very few papers that have looked at occupancy and distribution and used bioacoustics as sort of on a landscape scale. Brett Furness is probably, the person to look up in terms of how that's been done. I think the paper I published earlier this year, start of this year, was the first paper that combined bioacoustics and occupancy model in Europe, and is probably one of the few that have been done, even though it's a standard approach within camera trapping, as you probably know. To do that, it's not really been tested a lot for bioacoustics. And in terms of density, then you can use that to a certain amount for birds. So there's a couple of papers that I'm not super familiar with that have looked at that, but trying to convert bird sound, the number of calls or whatever, to a number of birds can be quite tricky to do. and again, if you want to read up on that, then Christian Perez Granados has written a couple of papers on vocal activity rates and how you convert acoustic recordings to number of birds when in a particular area. But that really depends on the species you're dealing with, I think. So
Carly's also dropped in a couple of references to help answer that question, so they're in the notes. Sasha Heath, are you still around, and do you have a microphone? Nope. Okay, I'm going to read out your question. She asks, is there any reason to not sample at higher rates, e.g. for bats, for not only bats, but also animals with sounds at lower sampling rates, and then to deal with separating these out with subsampling during post-processing?
No, it's super good to do. The only real issue in using higher sample rates is that the file size is bigger, so your card will fill up. You know, if you're going from 48 up to 96 or 192 sample rate, your card will fill up 2 or 3 or 4 times quicker, and you will have bigger file sizes to deal with as well. But if you are, you know, if you can get to the recorder and you're willing to deal with that data mounting and change the cards over, then record at higher rates, and you can either keep it at that sample rate, or you can downsample to reduce file sizes if you decide you don't need the higher frequency end to start with. One really good example of that is the Stuart Newson, who works for the BTO in the UK, his Norfolk Bats project, where they recorded with bat detectors bats at a whole range of hundreds of locations around a part of the UK, and took advantage of all the bycatch, as they called it, that came from that everything that was recorded at a lower frequency, whenever a bat flew past and triggered, there might have been an owl calling in the background or something else, or other birds singing, were also recorded as well. So that's one really good thing about acoustic data, is that you can, it's fairly, you know, taxon agnostic. If it makes a noise, yeah, you can record it at the same time as you're recording something else that makes a noise as well. So no.
Then there were some questions around metadata. People wanted to hear more about metadata, and Carlos asked, any standard metadata format in particular?
Look at guano.md, which is a website which is the Grand Unified Acoustic Notation Ontology, is what it stands for. It's completely made up, but is a very comprehensive data standard for recording metadata for bats. And as I said, that is built in to every single WAV file that's recorded on wildlife acoustics devices. I can't speak for Audiomoths and other things. I'm not sure what their metadata within the file standard is. And there's a good paper which is mostly focused on marine mammals, actually Roche, which is one of the references back in the PowerPoint that also looks at metadata. So very important to record. If you read Wild Soundscapes by Bernie Krause, there is a little metadata print-off sheet somewhere in here, which is basically his old spreadsheet database that he used for recording information about all his recordings. So what metadata you want to record, some of it will be standard. So what microphone, what recorder, where, what was your location, what was the time of that particular file recording, what were the settings. But the metadata, you might want environmental metadata in terms of weather conditions, phase of the moon or whatever else it might be, would depend on the aims of your study. Metadata are important. Will vary slightly from project to project, but it can be built into part of the, and is built into part of the machines. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think the standards are enough, or is there a ways to go?
Those are pretty good for starting off. Myself and a couple of others trying to develop a recording protocol for pond acoustic surveys. So for invertebrates, fish and whatever else, and we record putting together a field recording sheet, a metadata standard for that, which is some of the stuff I've talked about, but also other things like the pond area, pond depth, how much vegetation there is in it as well. And so that will have a specific sort of metadata standard that goes along for all those pond acoustic surveys, and will give the environmental information that we can then use to sort of correlate with the sound recording data we're getting as well.
Okay. Matt, do you have a mic?
Can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Yeah, so was this the question? Sorry, I'm not in the document right now.
No, that's fine. You had a
question about Audiomoth comparison?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I was curious, I guess for the larger group or the speaker, if anyone's compared the performance of Audiomoth to some of those more expensive units, like the Swift or the SM units?
So, yes, to a certain extent. I think some people have done this privately. If you look in the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, acoustic monitoring guidelines, there's some comparison spectrograms that have been put in there by Ella Gibb, Kate Jones and the authors that show what the background and self noise is like. Basically, within an Audiomoth, the microphone is a standard mobile phone mic, pretty much. MEMS, tiny little microphone, a couple of millimeters across, that costs, £1.50 or a couple of dollars, whatever else it is. It covers a great frequency range, but there's two issues. The recording quality is not great. It's not a fantastic microphone, and currently, this is going to change in future versions, the consistency in the sensitivity between different microphones is not the same. So one Audiomoth is not the same as another Audiomoth in terms of its frequency and amplitude sensitivity, so you won't get exact same data from each. There's also a lot of background noise and hiss when you listen to them or see them on the screen compared to other more expensive microphones. Yeah, so microphones on a Swift, Frontier Labs or a Wildlife Acoustics unit, yeah, they're big. Can I pull this off without snapping the microphone off? Yeah, oh, there you go. My screen blur is not doing very well. It's about a centimetre across. The diaphragm's bigger, the sensitivity is bigger, and they're also swappable as well. So when that microphone dies, from being out in the field for 2 years, you can just swap the microphone, which you can't do on an Audiomoth. You'd have to throw the whole thing away. So certainly the quality is not as good, and the consistency is not as good, and they'd also be quite hard to check. When you're checking a microphone, normally use a piston phone, ideally on an acoustic mic, which basically seals onto the microphone and then blows a certain volume of air at it at a certain pressure, and you can see how that pressure that's received by the microphone varies from one mic to another. You couldn't do that just because of the physical nature of the MEMS mic on an Audiomoth, so you would be it's harder to calibrate and assess those. So £50 is great, yeah. 500 or £1,000, yeah, better. As well as some of the practical aspects that I've talked about in terms of swapping cards, programming them, and all the rest of it as well.
All right, last question. Pete, do you want to jump in with your question?
Hi, yeah, a couple of questions. So is there an optimum number of recorders per hectare or site to get an accurate sample for the site? And then also, are there any kind of case studies of this being run by any NGOs in the UK, like Wildlife Trust, for example, or link-ups between NGOs and universities?
I would say that the UK is well behind a lot of other countries. Tessa next week is going to be talking about managing projects with 1,000 Audiomoths in or whatever else it is. Really, the bird world in the UK is not taken on passive acoustic monitoring. There's plenty of birders who go out with, shotgun mic and record birds when they're birding. Very few people are using passive methods for bird monitoring.
That's partly something to do with population density.
No, no.
Okay.
No, I think it's. I think that in the UK we used to doing bird surveys by walking around.
Yeah.
And we do walked transects. While if you go to Canada or the States or whatever, it's all point count surveys. And so the passive acoustic monitoring is a really good analogy for doing a point count survey. Yeah, we don't really use point counts that much in the UK. Never have. Really for a lot of our sort of national or commercial surveys, and so it's a different way of recording entirely. So yeah, population density might be something as well, though, that yeah, driving 300 miles to go and do a bird survey in Canada is probably pretty normal. Less so in the UK. The only one in the UK that's currently starting is the Bat Conservation Trust are starting a national bat monitoring program using Audiomoths, where they're basically sending Audiomoths out to a few hundred people. They did a pilot project last year down in the southwest, so Devon, Cornwall, and are then allowing people to upload all this huge mountain of data to some server in the sky somewhere, and then trying to use that as a national monitoring system. So that's the only one so far. You also asked about density of units. Density of units, if you're looking at distribution, occupancy modelling, that sort of thing, then the density of units ideally should fairly closely match what the territory size of the species you're trying to record is. And my recommendation in the UK sort of setting for general sort of lowland habitats, 250 metres between recording units gives you 16 dots per square kilometre. And if you're looking at a nature reserve or a development site that you're doing an environmental impact assessment on, then that probably gives you a good starting point, especially if you're moving detectors around sort of on a weekly basis. Yeah, let the card and the batteries run out, shift them to another spot within there, and over the course of a month, yeah, each detector does sort of 4 weeks of recording at different locations, and you cover the ground pretty well.
Okay, I think we're going to put a pin in it there as we've hit the hour. But thank you so much, Carlos. That was fascinating, and I think you just gave us a fantastic starting point for getting going with acoustic surveys. And I mean, you packed that presentation full of links as well, so we'll be going through them and putting them into our document.
Yeah.
But yes, Ellie's just dropped a link in for Tessa's talk next week, and these two will go quite well together. We did plan it that way, but suffice to say, thanks everyone, and thanks Carlos, and thanks Ellie for making things run behind the scenes, and we'll see you all next week.